Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network. Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over. Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast, and we take a plain English look at some of the biggest questions in property. Now, I'm joined today by one of Australia's top buyers agents, Amy Lunardi. Welcome, Amy. How's your week been?
My week has been pretty good, Pete. I mean, I'm a little bit jealous of you being overseas at the moment. We are stuck here in the middle of winter and it's about 5 degrees outside, and you're over in sunny England at the moment.
Yeah, it's been hot actually over here. Yes, nice. It doesn't stay like that all year round, but certainly,
no.
Yeah, certainly the last couple of months have been very nice indeed. So yes, I'll be back in Melbourne at some point soon, no doubt though. So thanks for joining us today, everybody. We will be covering today house and land packages, and we always love to answer any of your questions and be guided by you. So if you want to ask any further questions, don't hesitate to get in contact via the link in the show notes. We'll also put links in there to the stories we're talking about. So Amy, lots to talk about this week, house and land packages. So let's start right at the top by explaining, well, what is a house and land package and how is that different from buying, say, like an off-the-plan property or an established property?
Yeah. Well, let's start off by also mentioning, Pete, that you and I, as buyers agents, we don't specialize in or necessarily work in the field of house and land. We buy established properties for our clients, and we're going to run through the reasons why today. And it's not to say that we are necessarily completely against this option if it's the right option for you. But definitely from an investment perspective, it is something that we don't necessarily focus on. And with house and land packages, so I like to call it land and house because the most common situation when you're buying these types of properties is when you purchase the block of land first and then you settle on that block of land and then you build a house later on. That's the most common, but everyone just tends to call it house and land packages. And the package option is, I was speaking to a friend that works in mortgages at Commonwealth Bank, and she said she doesn't commonly see packages, which is where you do actually buy the land and house together, but you're still building it, but you're more locked in with that particular developer or that builder. So it kind of comes as a package. But the most common is buying the land first and then the house later. And the big difference there between that and established is you've got 2 contracts and therefore 2 loans. First of all, you need to go and buy and find a block of land and get a loan for that and settle that, and then go and find a builder and get a build contract and get a construction loan and then go through that process, in comparison to buying an established property where it's one contract and that property is ready to go, or an off-the-plan property. That is one which may not have been built yet, but it's still just one contract and you're not responsible for that build process. You don't have to go and find that builder. It's all going to be done for you. So that's the sort of key difference between those 3 types of properties.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I guess one of the key challenges, particularly at the moment, is if you were to jump onto one of the main real estate portals and do a filtered search for blocks of land, there just don't seem to be that many available, especially to somebody just jumping online and doing a search. And I guess we've got record high population growth, land releases notoriously slow. Australia doesn't seem to keep up with the demand. So it can be quite a challenge for people to find good vacant blocks of land. And when they do, they're often priced pretty high. So what are some of the reasons that people would choose to go down the house and land package route, in your opinion?
Well, I might just sort of rewind on your point just there, Pete, to talk about the different types of land you might come across. If you want to go out and buy a block of land which is already titled, that means it's already been subdivided and you can buy it and settle on it straight away and go build as soon as you can. Those are pretty rare. They're pretty hard to find.
Very hard.
So the more common ones that you will tend to see in land and house or house and land is ones that haven't yet been titled. So you're going out and finding something which hasn't, just picture like a massive paddock. I'm just going to be, so you can have something in your mind. And that paddock hasn't been split up into little blocks of land as yet. There's a plan to do so, and you're going to be buying one of those lots, but it hasn't been chopped up into little pieces yet. Or think of a big birthday cake and you're buying one of those slices of cake, but they haven't cut it up yet for you. And the process of cutting that up and being able for you to then go and buy that and settle it and build on that, it can take a really long time. So you might purchase it now and they're not going to cut it up for you for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe even longer, and delays can happen. And those are blocks of land which we called not yet titled. So it's important to understand the difference between those, because there is also, that leads on to other kinds of issues and risks, which we'll talk about in a moment. So Pete, to actually come back and answer your question, why would someone consider this kind of option? Well, let's address this first from a home perspective, because there is a difference between buying it as a home versus an investment. If you're buying it to live in, it's generally going to be a lot more affordable for you to buy these types of properties in comparison to buying that same product, that same size property and, land size and condition closer in an already established area. So you might be able to get a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, brand new house with a double garage for within your budget, even though it's going to be a lot further out, or you might not be able to get in there straight away because you've got to build it. And if that's something that is of value to you, you want that space and size, and you've got a family, or you want the double garage, or you just want a brand new house, that can be really appealing to you. You can pay less stamp duty because you're only paying stamp duty on the land rather than on the full house. And also you can make changes to the design. You can customize it sometimes. Depending on what builder, if you're going with a volume builder or a custom builder, you can make a lot of changes, or at least choose the interior design to a certain extent. So that can be really appealing to a lot of people. You can also lock in the price of the land now. So if that land value goes up and you're ready to build in a couple of years and values have gone up, well, you've bought something at yesterday's prices. And bear in mind that doesn't always happen. Land doesn't always go up. But sometimes, especially if you get in at the start, like one of those initial land releases, when they're releasing estates, your land can be worth more, basically, when you settle. Not always. And then lastly, the first home owners grant, which is cash money that the government is giving to you. And how often do you get given free money from the government, which, depending on which state you live in, could be, say, $10,000 or $20,000 to go towards this property. So those are a couple of benefits. But Pete, what do you reckon are some drawbacks if you're considering buying and living in one of these types of properties?
Yeah, that's really well explained. I remember when I was growing up, I remember my parents used to say, like, for people who actually build their own homes, as a rule of thumb, they used to say it would probably cost half as much. I guess that doesn't really apply so much these days, not least with the way the cost of building materials have gone over the past 2 or 3 years. But generally, I guess that's the thing, isn't it? If you're building on the city fringe, the land values can be a bit lower than where the established prices are closer into the city. So it could be more affordable. I think a lot of people like just the idea of brand new accommodation, especially I think popular with new migrants. A lot of Asian migrants really like the idea of a brand new property, less focused on location quite often, because as a new arrival to the country, you're not necessarily tied in to any specific location. And yes, the incentives is a big one, isn't it? I mean, these are a bit of a movable feast, so you need to check what's available in your state and now. But things like stamp duty concessions, first homeowners grants, there's been other initiatives in terms of lending schemes, Key Start. So I think it's a big draw card for some people if the government is, as you said, incentivizing you to do it. We saw through the pandemic when the government introduces incentives, they do work for new housing.
They do work, yeah.
Yeah. So yes, now the flip side, as you mentioned, as buyers agents, we generally focused on established properties that are already built. In many respects, it's more of a known quantity doing that. You know what you're getting. You can base your sort of offer price on a range of comparable sales, but that's not necessarily the case when you're doing the house and land option. So yeah, the drawbacks can be sometimes the location. I mean, almost by definition, quite often these sort of new house and land packages or estates, they're further out, less close to things like amenities, lifestyle. I think almost as by definition as well, there's less scarcity because very often, as you mentioned, they're part of significant land releases. So it's not just going to be one block of land. There's going to be multiple and sometimes dozens and dozens of blocks. So there could be less scarcity in the product.
Pete, I was flying in from wherever I was recently and coming in over the northern part of Melbourne, and here and there I could just see patches of areas which had been built up with house and land, and they were just these little islands in the middle of these big empty vacant blocks of land. So even within that estate, you're buying something which doesn't have a lot of like scarcity value because there's a lot of other very similar properties to start with, but then also there is that big risk of all of those other all of that other land around you being built up over time as well. And yeah, like you've just said, not as much scarcity there, and that can actually impact your future resale value, which from a homeowner perspective you might not be bothered about so much, but certainly from an investment perspective, very relevant.
At the extreme end of the spectrum, if you're thinking about market cycles, thinking back to 2007, 8, 9 in countries like Spain and Ireland, and there were great big swathes of land being released. And these days you'd be easily able to see it on things like Google Earth. But yes, that's really a market cycle thing. But yes, definitely less scarcity in the product. I think the other thing is that, I mean, almost always there's going to be more unknowns in buying a property that isn't built yet. Things like unexpected costs. We've seen over the past couple of years the fixed price contracts, but then suddenly the cost of materials has gone up. So then there's things like risks for the builder and developer. We've seen lots of insolvencies. There's been no end of stories over recent cycles relating to build quality. We find quite often teething issues with new properties within relatively short space of time, and things like even just the unexpected delays to the build takes longer than expected. So I guess and
all the while you're paying a mortgage, you're paying interest on. I mean, it's a little bit of a different way, a different kind of loan. When you've got a construction loan, you're only paying interest only on the part that you've drawn down at that point in time, but it's still costing you, and then you're living elsewhere, probably where you're building as well. And delays are very, very, very common. So if your builder says, I'm going to be finished on September 1st, please don't book the moving van for then. Just know that could be a month, it could be 6 months of a delay, and that can, eat into your budget.
I think, yes, you're right. I mean, overarching point really is that there is some financing risk here as well. For example, you mentioned what happens if the land value actually decreases. Now, most of the time you expect land values to rise, but that's not necessarily always the case and everywhere, and depending on the stage of the cycle. And as you mentioned, if the build cost ends up being different to what you initially expected, some financing risk is there as well. Now,
well, that's probably one of the bigger risks, I'd say, Pete, because like off the plan where you have a pre-approval now and you might be in a good financial position, but by the time that property is ready to title and then you're ready to build on it, your situation could change too. Lenders' policies could change. like you said, your valuation might come in lower than what you've paid. And it's so hard to predict the future. And we're talking about, can be many years into the future. And then you have to go and get a construction loan to build this property. So all of a sudden, what seemed like a good idea right now, if your circumstances change or just circumstances beyond your control change, you can be in a position where you might not be able to settle on that piece of land. You might need to come up with a contingency plan, borrow money off someone to settle, or you might not then be able to afford to build, and then you have to offload that land. And if you can, great, but it's not a guarantee, and you might not come out ahead on that. So that's a big risk, finance risk. And like you said too, Pete, the cost, the unexpected costs with building, your builder might, start digging and hit rock, and it escalates the costs or other things which you hadn't factored in, and you need to come up with that money. Or build costs having gone up recently, and builders, there have been a lot of sort of private negotiations between builders to say, well, if we want to finish your product, yes, we've committed to this contract, but we're going to have to charge you more. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to complete it. And sometimes those people have just had to say, grin and bear it, and have to pay those extra costs to avoid the risk of not ending up with an unfinished build.
In recent times, yes, there's been shortages of tradies, shortages of materials, cost overrun. So those things have all been, that's quite a timely point. You mentioned for a family, the idea of sort of building a new home that they can design or customize or make it bespoke in some way. It's brand new. I really understand the motivation there. But what about for an investor, Amy? We often see investors being advised or lured into sort of buying house and land packages. But why would an investor go down the route of buying or investing in something that isn't yet built? I suppose the typical things I see advertised or suggested could be you could potentially get strong depreciation benefits, particularly in a new house. I think the depreciation benefits would be very high. It is said that a brand new property could be easier to rent out, which I think is probably true initially, provided you're not one of dozens and dozens of houses hitting the market at the same time. And I guess theoretically anyway, you could make some capital gain if the land and build cost is less than the value of the final product. I guess those would be the typical reasons that an investor might look at it.
Yeah, and I think we could probably approach those as saying they're not necessarily as shiny of a benefit as they seem, in that depreciation is a recognition of a loss, right? It might be easier on the hip pocket with your cash flow once you do your tax return and you get a nice amount of money back. But that's because you've bought a brand new product, and kind of like when you buy a brand new car and drive out of the showroom, it depreciates straight away. So it's a recognition of that loss. But yeah, in theory, some we'll call them investment advisors in quotation marks here will pitch that as the main key benefit. And that is a really much that's very much a red flag when you are an investor and you get pitched brand new properties and house and land type properties as great investments, because quite commonly these people who are selling them are getting hefty commissions from selling them, and they make it seem really appealing. But you need to understand how that person is getting paid and really question what the true benefits are here. Because you said, Pete, yes, a brand new property may be easier to rent out, but is there actually going to be a rental market for where you're looking? I tend to find that a lot of people go out to these areas to live, to buy a house to live in, not necessarily to rent. And those areas can be a lot less connected to job hubs, connected to the CBD. You might get stuck on the freeway for 90 minutes to get into town, and there might not be public transport out there. So there might not actually be as strong of a rental market as you expect. And then, like you said, Pete, you might make a capital gain if the land increases in value, and on paper that could look good. But what was your opportunity cost there? Where else could you have put that money? And if land had increased there, well, had it increased the same, if not more, in an established area? So just understanding that you need to focus on the broader picture here. because the drawbacks are, well, first of all, if it's the same risks as what we talked about. If you're buying this and then building it, as an investor, you're going to experience all of the same risks that we talk about from a home buyer perspective, in the finance risks and the build risks, and it's a lot more effort. But it's also, you could not have to go through the house and land building process, and as an investor, you might just be buying the end product. And in which case, you still have the drawbacks of having a depreciating product in an area with less scarcity, et cetera, but then may not have to take on that risk of financing and building, et cetera. So from an investment perspective, you might be considering this type of option either at the start, land and house, or at the end and essentially buying a brand new property in one of these estates areas and mitigating the risk a little bit.
There have been issues, I think, in Melbourne, actually, with some of the new land releases whereby the new properties aren't actually within walking distance of transport. And then there's an almighty shit fight for people driving to train stations in the morning, completely unable to find parking, abandoning cars to the side of the road. It's just, teething issues, not just with properties, but actually with fringe or greenfield estates sometimes. So I think that is definitely one thing you really want to watch out for, is walkability to things like amenities, transport, cafes, restaurants, school zones. I think sometimes, with some of the new releases, there just isn't infrastructure provided, at least initially. So that's definitely an issue. I think you mentioned there advisor commissions. I mean, this is just a recurring theme in the industry, but without generalizing too much, if you get recommended a new property by an accountant, financial planner, property advisor, I would say most of the time, in my experience, if someone's recommending that you buy a new property, it's usually self-interest, because there's a commission involved, very often in the range of 6 to 8% of the purchase price quite often.
And an accountant and a financial planner should never be recommending a specific product or location or development to you. That is a huge red flag, isn't it, Pete?
I think, yes, in my experience, often, you have to question why, in these instances, why does the builder or developer need to pay such a large commission to get the property sold? It's not an indication usually of a strong performing asset, quite the opposite. The same could apply if you see things like guaranteed rent returns. People are sort of drawn in by the idea of a guaranteed, say, 5% rental yield for the first couple of years. But again, you've got to question why. Why is that guarantee in place? And what happens when it ends? So those can be things like red flags. I think in terms of if you're looking for certain developers, is it anything that buyers who are going down this route could do to make sure that they're dealing with a reputable developer? Because I guess one of the key issues in the industry at the moment is there's lots of insolvencies, builders and developers and construction companies going into voluntary administration. It's a red hot issue at the moment. Is there anything that people can do there to offset that risk?
Yes and no, Pete. Yes, to a certain point. You can do as much research as you can on that developer or that builder. You can have a look at their previous products. You can talk to people that have used them before to understand if they were building on time, to make sure that there's no delays. Because if you're working with a builder and they constantly have delays, well, that's costing them as well, and that could eat into their cash flows. You could ask your solicitor to do some extra checks on them to see if they have any, strikes against them. And, there are all of these extra things that you can do, but ultimately it is completely outside of your control. And we've seen recently where it's a case that even the bigger companies aren't protected with all of this. In fact, they may actually be at more risk because their margins are lower. So when costs go up or when timeframes blow out, they are more susceptible. So the short answer is you cannot protect yourself completely, even if you've done all of your research. And even if that builder is doing well at that point in time, that may change in the future. So this is a very important risk that you need to go into this understanding that it can be costly and you cannot mitigate and minimize this risk completely.
Yes, certainly been a big challenge, and we keep getting more and more media articles about even some quite significant players in the industry coming under pressure or facing insolvency. So we've covered some of the key issues there, Amy, and I think our experience has been there's less risk in buying established property. What are some of the other considerations for people looking at house and land packages? I guess if you're looking at a vacant block of land, some of the things you would look at, for example, a flat block of land is typically a lot easier to build on than a sloped block, which can add additional challenges and cost. I think as well, I guess when you're looking at vacant land, you would consider things like orientation. Are you getting a north-facing block that could capture some of the winter sun? And also, we already mentioned that the amenity aspect. If you're too isolated, too far away from sort of the local amenities or entertainment, then that could be a bit of a problem in its own right. And I guess another key consideration is things like rules and regulations, because councils can have restrictions around things like noise. There's also things like considerations of parking requirements and
pets as
outdoor
well.
Space
could be
covenants. Yeah, I think so. An awareness of the potential risks around rules and regs is obviously another key thing you would have to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And when you're buying into these larger estates, especially if they're not yet built, it can be a little bit challenging to picture what they're going to look like. But they'll generally come with, or you'll be able to obtain like the plans, the master plan of that area, and you'll be able to see where the bus stops are and where the shopping strip is, and all of these things too. So you can factor that into your decision making. But certainly there are extra steps that you can take in your due diligence phase at the very beginning. And also understanding that when you go and have a look at these beautiful showrooms, or you're walking through display suites, that's not necessarily the product that you're going to be buying if you're buying the base package, because those display suites might have all of these extra upgrades and extra things which do cost you money. So it's really important just to understand, if you're committing to a build contract, what does that include, and how does that compare to what you've pictured you're going to be getting because you've walked through that display suite. So a lot of extra things that you need to do along the way. And then also just having that really close relationship and a lot of discussions with your mortgage broker around what are the risks here? What are my finance risks? What will happen if, for whatever reason, my land depreciates in value and at settlement time, how can I minimize that risk, or what would my other options be? And am I definitely going to be in a position where I can get approved for a construction loan? And if so, how much will I be able to get approved for? And then go and make sure that you can build the product that you want for that amount. So don't just say this is an issue for future me. I've bought this land now and it's not going to title for a year or two. I'll just deal with it later on. Make sure you go into that knowing exactly what you're going to get out of it at the end, and that you can afford it.
We've talked a lot, Amy, here about the risks of house and land packages, and that's, to a large degree based on our personal experience. We've seen plenty of instances of people paying top dollar for a brand new property or brand new home, but then finding 3 or 4 years down the track that, as you said, it's no longer a new property, and sometimes there's been some depreciation. I think, though, regardless of whatever we say on this podcast, I think the history shows that when the government puts incentives in place, especially for first-time buyers, people are going to go down this route. So I think if you're a first-time buyer who's considering this, I was actually talking to Chris on the podcast only last week, and he said that they're finding at the moment in the mortgage broking space, it's very hard with borrowing capacities having reduced over the past 12 or 15 months at the time of recording. Actually, a lot of people just can't get into these new properties now. The first-time buyers are struggling to bring up the financing. But if you're going to go down that route, I guess those are two key considerations. Firstly, what incentives are on offer, things like stamp duty concessions. We've recently seen the first home guarantee scheme, where some first-time buyers are bought with just, say, a 5% deposit. And I think the other thing is just having a really good understanding of how these deals are financed. Now, a house and land package, it may well be packaged up so you know what the total cost should be. But as you touched on before, you potentially here looking at a two-part financing process. Firstly, the land purchase, and then secondly, for the house construction, which can be useful, I guess, Amy, in the sense that if you know what your budget is, and also potentially you're only making payments on construction as it progresses in installments. But again, there's potential risks here, I guess, as you already touched on, especially in an environment at the moment where interest rates are going up. So you've got to be really careful about things like cost and time overruns because,
it all adds up, doesn't it, Pete?
Yeah, and the first decision onto the housing ladder, you can arguably say that's the most important, because if you get the first one right, all subsequent decisions are going to become easier. You can leverage on the good results. But if you get the first one wrong, it can really set you back quite a number of years on your journey.
It can. And maybe an additional resource, and I haven't actually gone onto these websites before, but I had a friend build land and house not too long ago. And during that process, they went on these forums online, and maybe just Google it. I'm sure you'll be able to find them somewhere. But within those forums, there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people just talking about their experience going through the process, mistakes that they had made, things that they weren't aware of, builders that they'd had good or bad experiences with. And it helped my friend create almost like a checklist for themselves throughout the process to know, okay, well, these are the questions I asked at this point in time. These are the things that I need to be aware of. So it is up to you to a certain extent to go and put all of this time and effort into it, because you don't know what you don't know. And then if you don't understand everything, you won't know the right questions to ask or people to speak to along the way. So certainly from a risk perspective, in comparison to buying an established property, much, much higher risk, much more uncertainty. But at the end of the day, if what you value, specifically I'm talking about as a homeowner, is that size and space and the brand newness of that property, and that's what's really important to you, then all of those risks might be something that you're willing to take on. And I've certainly seen plenty of people buy in these areas and they've been really, really happy. But then I've also seen other issues where things have gone very, very wrong. So go into it with eyes wide open. And the key thing here with any property purchase, house and land, off the plan, established, is to know all of the benefits and drawbacks and weigh it up going into it, and then make a decision that's right for you.
It can be quite a journey, and it can be stressful, I guess, as well, Amy. I think, as you know, every project and every package is going to be different, but you need to factor in potentially 18 months, 2 years, from the start of the process, from buying the land to actually getting the keys and moving in. It can be 2 years. I think there's data out from PropTrack that shows, although home building you would think is quicker and easier these days, on average though, the journey is currently 22 months. There's been delays for various reasons of late, but it does show that with all the potential things that could impact the home building journey, things like bad weather, depending on where you are in the country, we get torrential downpours, things like sourcing materials has been really difficult of late. So you do really need to factor in that the journey is not necessarily going to be a short one. And look, this is an opinion, but it is statistically backed up as well. I would say as an investor, there's less risk and there's usually a better bang for your buck than going down the house and land package. But for a home buyer, sometimes people do prefer to go down that route. And if that's you, then just be aware of the risks. And as you mentioned, you've got to take steps to mitigate them.
That's right. It's like online dating. There's an option out there for everyone, and what's going to work for someone won't necessarily work for someone else.
I'll take your word for that one. I'm not been active in the space anytime
I'm sure
recently,
you could presume what it's like though, Pete.
Yes, I have heard. Yes. So that's as you mentioned, there's plenty of good online resources as well these days. So
Tinder, OkCupid.
I was thinking more in the house and land package. But yes, if that's you as well, then yes, we'll leave some links in the show notes if you want to send Amy your questions on the specifics of online dating. So, Amy, is there anything else we haven't covered off today in terms of the pros, cons, and risks of house and loan packages?
No, I think we've summed it all up, Pete. And like we said, this is not the types of properties we buy. Very much from an investment perspective, but from a home buyer perspective, it might be a good option for you. It might be not a good option for you. Maybe we've turned you off it by having a chat about all of the risks today, but that's what we're here to do, Pete. We're here to highlight the pros and cons and let you make your own decision. So thank you very much. And time for me to start my day and time for you to go to bed, Pete.
It is. Yes, it's certainly building and buying new has certainly gone out of favour over the past few months or past 6 months, and actually lending now to buy or build a new home is at the lowest level since 2008. So a lot of people are seeing the risks and just deciding it's just not worth it for them at the moment. So yes, thank you so much for tuning in. As always, do send us your property questions by the link in the show notes. We'd love to cover what's topical, what's hot, and what you want to hear about. You can catch me at Pete Wargent Blogspot. That's my daily blog, at Pete Wargent on Twitter, if you must. And also do subscribe for the Rask Media podcasts via your favourite podcast player, and of course on YouTube. And Amy, if people want to find out more about you and your services, where can they go to for more?
So I have an online course at thefirsthomeguidebook.com.au, or you can also follow me at Amy Lunardi Property on Instagram. So thank you again to everyone who has listened today, and we'll see you next time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amy. Enjoy your lovely winter's day in Melbourne, and we'll chat soon.
See you, Pete.
Cheers.